Um, Welcome to this event. My name is Tetyana Filevska. I'm the creative director of the Ukrainian Institute, which is Ukraine state institution for the cultural diplomacy. I'm also curating the public program of the Ukrainian Pavilion together with the curators of the Pavilion. We are now opening the fourth and the final event in the series of the public talks that were held starting from April until November throughout the whole duration of the biennial. The public program is dedicated mainly to the issue of decoloniality in regards to the Ukrainian situation at the moment, which means the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February. I would like to thank all the partners who helped to organize this event, and to thank, first of all, the team of the Ukrainian Pavilion and the Naked Room, to thank the International Renaissance Foundation, the House of Europe, to thank Open Space NGO, Ukrainian NGO, and Estonian Ministry of Culture. And I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Ukrainian Institute, and in particular, Lesa Bolot, for managing the event. Each of these events had a separate topic, and today's event is dedicated to decoloniality and biennials. Before we jump into the program, I would like to give a brief introduction on why this topic is important in the frameworks of the conversation on decoloniality. If I may ask for my presentation, please. Thank you. The world now has about 100 major biennials. So biennials are big artistic events which happen mostly one in every 5 years, and they cover now all the world, all the regions of the world, all the major countries. But there was one first biennial. It was the Biennale di Venezia. It was the archetype for all the furthest. It happened 127 years ago here in the city of Venice, and it's still on, and we are today at the 59th edition of this biennial. Recently, just a few years ago, the biennial decided to look at its own history in relation to the historical context, the important political events, and not only political, social, economic events that took place in its duration. The exhibition titled The Disquieted Muses was dedicated to 125th anniversary of the biennial, and actually told about the history of all the biennials, which are not only about art, visual art, but also theater, music, cinema, and architecture. It's interesting that almost at the same time, another big biennial, also a trendsetter in the world of visual art and the world of biennials, Documenta, that takes place actually once every 5 years, so it's not the classical, it's not biennial in its classical sense, but also an important, huge event in the art world. Also had a similar exhibition excavating its own history. It was called Documenta, Politics and Art. It was held at the end of 21 and the beginning of 22nd year. And it also discovered the history behind Documenta and how it was entangled in Germany's political history of 20th century. One of the recent biennials, the Berlin Biennial this year, was dedicated fully to the issue of decoloniality. So it made decoloniality its main topic, and all the artworks and curatorial statements were looking at this issue from different sides. We will not have a speaker saying about this experience, but we incorporated one of the artworks. It's the video work Dream Your Museum that we will be screening tomorrow from the Berlin Biennial. And another important forum of visual art, Manifesta, which also deals with decoloniality in its own principles that took place this year as well in Pristina, in Kosovo. And we also had shown an artwork that was both shown in Manifesta by Christian Njempeta. The work is titled "Sometimes It Was Beautiful," and it was really beautiful artwork on decoloniality that we watched here in September in the framework of our program. This year in the Venice Biennial, as well as in most of the biennials, Ukraine for the first time was receiving a lot of attention and was presented in different ways. For example, in Venice, there are two Ukrainian pavilions, one the National Pavilion, one is Emergency Pavilion in Giardini. And actually one of the first works that opened the main exhibition in Giardini is the work of Ukrainian artist Maria Primachenko. You can see it on this photograph just behind the elephant. But it's not the only big elephant in the room at this Venice Biennial. Of course, the Russian pavilion that stands empty this year and will probably stand empty for another few years is the topic that everyone thinks of, but so far not really was talked about. And we are about to talk about the Russian pavilion, its history, and its nowadays during the framework of this conference. And a speaker from Ukraine, Hanna Rudik, will talk about the history behind the Russian pavilion. So that was the, let's say, introduction why we have all these topics, and we will have representatives of from these institutions and also those who research the history of these institutions or biennials, and we will talk about how imperial legacy affects the biennial as such, how the whole narrative of the biennial is still entangled by this heritage. Today we will have a lecture by Ukrainian art journalist and researcher Anastasia Platonova, telling about Ukrainian presence at the Venice Biennale. And after that we will have a discussion about the actual imperial heritage of the Biennale. And tomorrow we will start with the screening of the film, and then a keynote about the history of Russian pavilion at Venice Biennale, and then a closing discussion. And now I would like to invite on this stage Anastasia Platonova. And before we start, can I please ask to reduce the light a little bit because it really hurts the eyes of the speaker.
Have a little less of light, please. Thank you. A little less, yeah. Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Tetyana, thank you very much for your kind introduction, and thank you very much for making this series of discussions, because it's precious now to have the open dialogue about the decolonization. And we can start. So, starting talking, it's curious, but starting talking about the history, about Ukrainian pavilion on Venice Biennale, and about Ukrainian presence at Venice in general, I would have to start from a brief history of Russian pavilion. We'll talk a bit later today if it's actual can be called Russian, but now a little bit of history. Yeah, it works. So, 1940. At the 11th Venice Biennale, the National Pavilion of Russia opened its doors for the first time. That's how it looked. Tomorrow we're going to have a keynote presentation by Hanna Rudik, my colleague, so I'll just briefly get you through history. 1914, a Russian pavilion in Venice opens, and Russian newspapers and authorities talk a lot about the role of the royal family in this opening, as well as the role of Russian architect Alexei Shushev. But they didn't say a single word about those whose money was spent on this project. And that was Ukrainian entrepreneur and philanthropist Mykola Tereshchenko. Here how he looks like. Tereshenkos were the famous philanthropist family not only in Kiev, but also in the whole Russian Empire. But Russia has always been silent about this fact and about the fact that Ukrainians were the sponsors of the Russian Pavilion in Venice. The reason why the international community shouldn't have known there is a history of collecting and philanthropy in Ukraine, because Tereshenko was not a single example. For example, his daughter Varvara, together with her husband Bogdan Hanenko, has made a great art collection, which later became a basis for Hanenko National Art Museum. It looks like this. The danger for Russia was that if international community would understood that Ukraine has not only its entrepreneurs, scientific and cultural elite, its philanthropists, that would automatically make us a modern urban nation in the eyes of the world, not illiterate farmers. And that was dangerous for Russia. Yeah. Let's keep going. Russia has always demonstrated imperial colonial thinking and attitude to its neighbors. It's not just about ignoring other people's subjectivity and sovereignty. This is the mentality that formed the strategic vector of development of Russia for several centuries, slowing down the progress of its neighbors. Russian colonial policy towards Ukraine always involved the appropriation of Ukrainian cultural names and phenomena. Thus, in the 19th and 20th centuries, artists, writers, and musicians could achieve wider recognition and success only in Moscow or St. Petersburg. In particular, all the art universities and academies existed only there. So, by the way, the opening of the Academy of Arts in Kiev in 1917 was a kind of cultural intervention and an act of resistance by the best avant-garde artists, including Kazimir Malevich and Marc Chagall. No need to say that Russia is also trying to appropriate both of these artists. The real purpose of this appropriation is to take away Ukraine's subjectivity. Saying that Alexandre Exter or David Burlyuk are Russian artists is like saying that there is no Ukraine, there is just a little Russia. There is exactly what the Russian Empire did for 100 years to Ukraine. There is exactly what Soviet Russia did as well, and it's exactly what Russia and Vladimir Putin are trying to do now. But look at us now. Here we are in Venice Biennale speaking about Ukraine, standing for Ukraine. And that's exactly what's made Russia disappear. Have you seen Russia in Biennale this year? No? That's exactly how it works. But Russia practices this disgusting imperial thinking, denying all the democratic values and using its old culture as a weapon. It's very important to understand. The example of such type of thinking is the director of the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Mikhail Piotrovsky. After the start of large-scale Russian invasion to Ukraine, he gave an interview where he said the following. I would quote now. We, means Russians, are all militarists and imperialists. On the one hand, war is blood and murder. But on the other hand, it's a self-assertion of the people, the self-assertion of the nation. We were grown up in the imperial tradition, and the empire always unites many people, finding common and important things in everyone. To me, it's absolutely awful, such an old school example of decolonial thinking. But by the way, that's exactly the person who was the curator of the Russian Pavilion and the Venice Biennale just in 2019. So it's closer to us that it's my peer. The appropriation and silencing, the deprivation of the right for existence and presence have always been and remain Russia's tools in this century-long civilizational war against Ukraine. When it wasn't possible to deprive Ukraine of its voice, Russia resorted to direct attacks. In a sad irony, on October 10th, one of the Russian missiles hit right near the entrance of the Hanenko Museum, causing damage to the building. That's how it looks. Trying to destroy Ukrainian cultural heritage, Russia is trying to tell us, we will just destroy you, in order to say you will never exist. But we still are here, and the question, is Russian Pavilion actually Russian, remains relevant. That is why it's so important to fight against aggressive Russia, not only on battlefield, where Ukrainians are fighting for the whole world now, but also in the field of culture and diplomacy, where the world should protect both itself and Ukraine. The Russian Empire and later the USSR participated in Venice Biennale, a little bit of history, from 1940, as I've mentioned, to 1930s, and then after a long break, came back to Giardini in 1956. For many times, Russia has presented their works by Ukrainian artists, calling them Russians. For example, in 1920, among other artists, the Russian Pavilion at the Venice Biennale was presented by works of Alexander Archipenko, Ukrainian artist, in 1924 by Kazimir Malevich and Alexander Ekster, in 1977 and in 1993 by Ilya Kabakov, and in 2003 by Sergei Bratkov. All these are Ukrainian artists, but Russia did everything to make the international audience perceive them as Russians. In the international museums, especially focused on the period of modernism, Ukrainian artists are still often labeled as Russian or Soviet ones. Kazimir Malevich, Alexander Ekster, David Burlyuk, Alexander Archipenko, and many others. We still have to fight with that. Unfortunately, it's not enough just to change the labels or explications and hope that the international audience will instantly realize the injustice of this situation with Ukrainian artists stolen by Russia. We would have a long way of decolonization and a serious conversation with the international professional community. It would need a lot of educational and advocacy practice, but we're ready for this. These are just few examples of how Russia managed to create an international image of great culture, great country with a great culture, by appropriation, depriving, and lies. The results of this are not so innocent. The European audience was for a long time really fascinated with this image of Russia and the idea that a country with such a culture couldn't turn out to be barbarians, but it's exactly what Russia is. The story about Ukrainian presence on the world cultural map is actually about visibility and the right to exist, not about the own pavilion in Giardini. Presence, in our case, is not the right by default. It's very important to understand. But something that is the result of a long and exhausting struggle. Throughout all our history, Ukraine is forced to fight not only for survival, but also for right to say we do exist. And I'm truly aware of how many Ukrainians made their efforts so that today I could stand here and speak about Ukraine. And so now let's talk a bit about actually the history behind the Ukrainian presence in Venice in the last 20 years. After USSR collapsed in 1991, Russia, at its hair, kept the National Pavilion in Giardini. This is an established practice of Russia. They always keep everything they have in common after a breakup by the right of force. Ukraine met the beginning of 1990s, not only with the gaining independence, but also with the artistic boom. Cultural institutions appeared and developed. Artists and curators visited international exhibitions and biennials for the first time. A lot of things happened for the first time. And this gave rise to the dream of own, separate from Russia, separate from anyone. Participation in the Venice Biennale, as Tetyana just mentioned, was an archetype biennial, and for Ukrainians as well. It was a pure dream. It was a dream of presence. In the second half of 19th, the participation in the Venice Biennale became a kind of real idea fixed for Ukrainian cultural field. The one who managed to implement it in reality was Jerzy Onuch, the director of Soros Center in Kiev. After visiting the Manifesta Biennial in Ljubljana, he had an idea of Ukrainian presence at one of the key world biennials. So in 2000, Ukraine's application to participate in Venice Biennale was approved. And in 2001, Ukraine finally was presented in Venice with first Ukrainian project, including the works by Arsen Savadov, Oleg Tistov, Yuri Solomko, Sergei Panich, Olga Melentsy, and Valentin Raevsky. Due to the lack of time and resources for a full-fledged pavilion, it was decided to show the project in the army tent, right in the middle of Giardini. The diorama with images of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was installed inside of the tent. That's how the first Ukrainian project in Venice Biennale looked like in 2001. In addition to that, and it's very important for Ukraine as well, that in 2001, two Ukrainian artists, Alexander Roitburt and Viktor Marushenko, took part in the main project of Biennial, being invited by curator of 49th Venice Biennale, Harald Zeman. So it was like very first time in Venice for Ukrainians. The Ukrainian debut in Venice, despite the organizational problems and lack of experience, let's be frank, became an extremely powerful driver for understanding where to move next and how important it is for Ukraine to integrate into the global context. After all, this is the guarantee of presence. Okay, let's move on. And so we started to gain the experience. In 2003, Viktor Sidorenko represented Ukraine in the 50th Venice Biennale. Sidorenko has been working on the Milestones of Time project since the 90s. That's how it looked. The project was dedicated to the time and the impact, its impact on people's lives. The endless movement of milestones symbolized the flow of time and the cyclical nature of life. That year's Ukraine received good location, so 2003 can be considered the first full-fledged case of Ukrainian representation in Venice Biennale. It's interesting that in 2003, another Ukrainian artist, Sergei Bratkov, also took part in Venice Biennale, but as a part of Russian Pavilion. And it's really interesting that it didn't cause any complaints in Ukraine. There was no feeling that Russia was taking away and appropriating our artists, and that this could cause some dangers. So we didn't have such feeling 20 years ago. The national project of 2005 was a reflection of the recent Orange Revolution in Ukraine, and at the Biennial in 2005, the Ukrainian Pavilion was presented by a personal project, this time by Mykola Babak. We don't have a slide of this project, but that project combined rural Ukrainian photography with folk rituals and amulets, as well as photos and videos of Orange Revolution. So at the same time, within Out of Competition program, the Viktor Pinchuk Foundation presented for the first time, and it was a really important moment, presenting the project First Acquisitions in Venice, which looked like a breakthrough compared to everything Ukraine has to show in Venice by that time. In Palazzo Papadopoli, there were works by Arsен Savadov, Boris Mikhailov, Vasily Tsagolov, as well as world stars like Olafur Eliasson were shown. That was a promise that very soon Ukrainian projects in Venice might look like much better. In 2007, really became a new starting point for Ukrainian presentation at the Venice Biennale. The organizer of Ukrainian Pavilion firstly came Pinchuk Art Center, and it already looked like this. And in the 52nd Biennale, the Ukrainian Pavilion was presented by the poem of the Inside Sea project, which included works by 8 artists from Ukraine, the USA, and Germany. The concept of the exhibition was to look at yourself from the inside and the outside at the same time. So in general, 2007 can be considered at the beginning of the new round of Ukrainian story in Venice. Our country, for the first time, has demonstrated a new approach to participation in the Biennial with a clear curatorial concept and a high level of participants. Let's move on. In 2009, Pinchuk Art Center became the organizer of the national presentation again. The Ukrainian National Pavilion in Venice was represented by Ilya Chichkan and Mihailo Yasuhiro. That's another project called Steps of Dreamers, and it was dedicated to dreams of distant wanderings. The main hero of the project was the owner of Palazzo Papadopoli in the 19th century, Nicola Papadopoulos, who was a traveler, visited Ukraine, Mongolia, China, repeating the famous route of Marco Polo. It was the most spectacular Ukrainian presentation in Venice. By that time, we had stronger projects conceptually, but still it was a new experience of visibility, with the sand cover Palazzo Papadopoli and billiards with the boxer Volodymyr Klitschko, who became the curator of the pavilion all over the city. That year, the Ukrainian pavilion was hard to miss, but the main thing was ahead. In 2011, Ukrainian Venice was represented by a personal project by Oksana Mas. Criticized a lot. Her monumental panel, which was a copy of an Ghent altarpiece, made from hand-painted wooden axe, looked ambiguous and really got a lot of critics. Pinchuk Art Center presented a side project. The Future Generation Art Prize exhibition included the works by Artem Volokityn in Palazzo Papadopoli. That's the picture. And today, those two projects really look like a very bright contrast between the desire to be seen and recognized and the desire to say something important. To me, it's obvious. In 2013, for the first time, Ukraine was represented in Venice by a group of young artists, star young artists of Ukraine, Жанна Кадирова, Микола Рідний, and Hamlet Zinkivsky. Their works somehow were a premonition of war, which began a year later in the Donbass. Their topics related to the Soviet past, decommunization, and commemoration practices. Жанна Кадирова presented No, it's not that work. Жанна Кадирова presented the video installation Monument to a Monument, depicting a hidden monument unknown to whom from different angles. Hamlet Zinkivsky showed drawings with a ballpoint pen called Alone with Myself in the installation, The Book of People. Here it is. Микола Рідний also presented two projects. Monument, a video of the construction of the monument of the heroes of the revolution in Kharkiv, and Shelter, a series of mock-ups of Soviet bomb shelters, and two documentary videos as well. After the main project of the Venice Biennale, Pinchuk Center traditionally presented their own exhibition. This time it was a project by the Rep Group and Nikita Kadan. Rep Group showed a plasterboard installation, European Renovation, and Nikita Kadan made a sculptural installation, Grandmother Provision Mausoleum, which was about 1,000 loaves of bread in a concrete structure. So the projects of 2013 can be considered as a new word of history of Ukrainian representation at the Venice Biennale. This is when visibility is guaranteed not by how loudly you shout, but by what you're talking about. And that was really important. Let's move on. Due to the war on Donbass, began in 2014, Ukraine almost left without the National Pavilion and the Venice Biennale in 2015. The state decided not to organize a national project in Venice that year, and the situation was traditionally saved by Pinchuk Art Center. At the last moment, appointed the commissioner of Ukrainian Biennial. Of Ukrainian Pavilion, excuse me. So Ukrainian 56th Biennial was presented by the stars of younger generation again. That again was Nikita Kadan, Жанна Кадирова, Микола Рідний, Євгенія Білорусець, Anna Звягинцева, and the Open Group. Minimalistic glass cube entitled Hope on the embankment near the Arsenal referred to the Ukrainian tent of 2001, the very first time of Ukraine in Venice. But it was a brand new project. The pavilion actually had no walls, but it was so open as open as possible to all passers-by walking along the embankment. Two artworks of Mikola Rydny also took part in the main project of that Biennale. One of the top topics to discuss on 56th Biennial was another Ukrainian initiative, a cultural intervention in the Russian Pavilion on Vacation, organized by the platform of all cultural initiative Izolyatsiya. Selfies from Russian Pavilion quickly boomed in all social networks, so the action received mentions in many world publications. Thus, Ukrainian artists and curators spoke to Russia in the language of capture that it understands, but in the field of culture. Unfortunately, Russia doesn't understand the language of senses, therefore we continue to use this weakness against it. For example, we're talking about the pavilion appropriated by Russia at the level of meanings and historical justice, not in the language of force. In 2017, the competition for the implementation of the project in Ukrainian National Pavilion was won by the Dallas Contemporary Museum with the project of Ilya and Emilia Kabakov. The idea of the project was to present the works of the number of Ukrainian artists in the format of open stage. But shortly, the artists suspended work on the project, citing health reasons. That, however, didn't prevent them from holding a solo exhibition in the Tate Gallery in the autumn of the same year. As a result, Ukrainian National Pavilion in 2017 was presented by Boris Mikhailov's Parliament project, work on which began in 2014 with the start of the war in Donbass. Mikhailov explored the image of the modern hero. The series of works consisted of abstract glitch portraits of politicians taken by Boris Mikhailov and his wife Vita from a TV screen. In 2017 was a sort of wake-up call for Ukraine. On the one hand, our young artists were already able to present projects that make interest from the international audience. From From other hand, excuse me, I need to find where was I? Just a second. Yes. On the other hand, just 5 years ago, our country was almost represented in the world by the artist who, let's be frank, I mean, Ilya Kabakov, who, let's be frank, is not a political Ukrainian and hardly shares our values. It was an important moment when reality showed us that art can't exist outside the politics, especially in the country where there is a war. And we have made our conclusions. And in 2019, during the selection of the Ukrainian National Pavilion for Venice Biennale, the serious competition between the artists of different generations broke up. As a result, the project by the open group, which was called The Falling Shadow of the Mria on Giardini, won, promising the flight of the symbol of Ukraine, the world's largest aircraft Mria over Giardini. There has been a lot of debate about whether it's technically possible. On the eve of the opening of the biennial, everyone asked, will the Mria fly? But the project turned out to be more like a gesture symbolizing the Ukrainian dream. In February 2022, the Mria aircraft, that's how Ukrainian Pavilion looked in 2019. And in February 2022, the Mria aircraft was destroyed by the Russian military forces at the Hostomel airport near Kiev. Russia always acts in the same way. It destroys your symbol in order to say you have never existed. Russia can destroy an aircraft or any other equipment, but no one can destroy the Ukrainian dream of living in a free, peaceful country. We will definitely restore Mria as well as our beautiful country. Now let's switch to 2012 and the war and the new reality. Because 2022 has fundamentally changed to the life of not only Ukraine, but the entire world. We have realized how fragile our lives could be, and that the times when one country wants to rule over others, cutting the boundaries of their neighbors, didn't lose in the distant past. Speaking of 2022 for Ukraine, at the Venice Biennale, I'm not going to talk about the project curated by Boris Filonenko, Elizaveta Herman, and Maria Lenko. You probably already saw it, you know, the idea behind it. I'd rather tell you about what's less known. For example, about how the curator Boris Filonenko and the artist Pavlo Makov have traveled to the Venice Biennale opening from the front line Kharkiv, which faced terrible missile attacks day and night. For months, the city has lost its historical center, but didn't lose its strength for resistance. I also want to tell you about the curator Elizaveta Herman, who left Kiev after the war started being pregnant. The capital of Kiev also struggling from the rocket attacks for all these months as well. Luckily, Liza didn't harm and gave birth in comparing safety in Lviv, but during all these 9 months, a lot of Ukrainian women are given birth in bomb shelters. And this is an awful crime against humanity. I would also like to tell you about another Ukrainian curator, Maria Lenko, who traveled by car from Ukraine to Europe for a few days, bringing with her fragments of the exposition for Ukrainian Pavilion. But it's not about just Maria. Actually, all the Ukrainians have to travel in such circumstances when trying to get to Europe or back home. This is how Ukrainians live, work, and travel now. We are the prize, but we're not the victims. We're the nation of warriors. All we want is to live freely on our own land to develop our country. We don't ask for anything except our basic rights for our territorial integrity and freedom of self-determination. But no less important for us is to be heard and understood. The presence has taken new meaning for us. Now it really means the word for us. When feeling recognized means you're alive. Presence is not about a pavilion in Giardini. It's definitely not about toxic imperial narratives. Presence is a subjectivity. It's about rights and commitments. It's about empathy and openness, about the willing to start the conversation and to keep it going, to see and to be seen, to be grateful and to be helpful. This year, Russia is out of the Venice Biennale, and this year, Ukraine is starting a serious discussion about decolonization. And those two facts are connected, because as soon as aggressive and toxic presence of Russia is disappeared, a lot of other voices automatically can be heard. So what's about the presence for Ukraine? Someone could told it's not about the place, but it's also about the place for the country which was invisible for such a long time. For us, it's a life and death question. Ukraine is ready for conversation. We are grateful for your support. Thank you very much for standing with Ukraine. Slava Ukraini!
Thank you so much. Thank you, Anastasia, for giving this historical overview. It gives you important insights to see this in kind of at one point and see some peculiar things, like Ukrainian presence at the Venice Biennale was oftentimes connected with the issue of war. So there was the military tent and the soldiers in the early presentations, and yeah, so it was a lot, and it was not intentional. It didn't feel like intentional, but it seems it was not accidental. We don't have a break. We just move into the discussion right away, and I would like to invite to come on this stage other speakers of the next part, the discussion on decoloniality and the biennials, and I would like to invite Hedwig Fijen. Hedwig is the founding director of Manifesta, the European Biennial of Contemporary Art, which started in early 90s in Rotterdam. And I would like to come to this stage Joanna Warsza, who is a co-curator of the Polish Pavilion at this year's 59th Biennale di Venezia, and she has developed a project with Małgorzata Mirtatas, the first Roma artist to be shown in any national pavilion in the La Biennale di Venezia. And another speaker is Nanne Buurman, who is an author, editor, curator, and educator working as a researcher and lecturer for Documenta and exhibition studies at the Kunsthochschule Kassel, where she's part of the team building the Documenta Institute since 2018. And first of all, I would like to ask the participants, the speakers, to give their statements and to tell about their institutions, the biennials, and then we'll discuss the issue altogether. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tetyana. I just had a cough, so hopefully my fisherman's is. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for inviting. Oh, there we are. To talk about decolonizing the biennial, because actually I always say we don't use that word that much, decolonizing, but rethinking, reinvestigating, re-exploring biennials is part of the DNA of Manifesta, and one would ask, why for Manifesta is this different than any other biennials? We just heard that there are 100 biennials in the world, which is already a kind of a statement in terms of artistic power structures. But in terms of Manifesta, we are the only nomadic biennial, which means we're moving from one place to another. Maybe for those who haven't seen a Manifesta, we just closed our 14th edition in Kosovo, Pristina, post-conflict country in the Western Balkan. And maybe another important part, Manifesta started as in the early 19 as an attempt to bridge the gaps, both on intellectual but also in terms of representation between East and West. And I'm always telling my own staff that there was Katrin David in the Documenta with whom we wanted to travel to Warsaw and to Moscow And that was at that time still a bridge too far. So there was really a crucial divide between East and West. But in the meantime, Manifesta has been taking place 14 times, many times in, let's say, disputed areas or underrepresented areas. I give you some: Donostia, San Sebastian in the Basque, when ETA was still bombing, Nicosia, a divided country in the Eastern Mediterranean, which was the only edition that flunked. We were set out of the country as terrorist activists. Marseille, Palermo, turning the city of mafia into the city of war, and Pristina, where we just closed. For my team, decolonizing is extremely important in terms of, we don't call it like this, but in 2019, where we were in Marseille, the south of France, we started a group called Discuss What Matters. And actually this was because of the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, and their social political movement in France. And for my team, it was extremely important to also identify decolonizing art institutions as biennials, mean normally reviewing the canon and questioning the ability to include different voices or perspective. And they always said, remember that decolonialization is not the same as diversity. It also includes the practice of going beyond the dominant cultural groups in a city and resisting the reproduction of the colonial taxonomies. Decolonizing biennials, in our case, I can't speak for others, but in our case, is evaluating every 2 years on programs. What do we do? Why do we do it? How do we do it? On our people, who is allowed to speak, in which voices, and of course, the partners, with whom do we work? And on the other hand, would mean raising equally fundamental questions about how stories are to be told, what the platforms of the dialogues are, how they function, and finally, who is allowed to say what, to speak, and able to tell stories otherwise. And I put it like a little bit ostensibly, this book on the table, because that is the title of the last Biennale, and it's Catherine Nichols who coined the title, How to Tell Stories Otherwise, which I think is extremely important at this time. So dialogues, how to function, and who is allowed to speak. And this is particularly an uncomfortable question we found out in Marseille, also in Pristina, but also in Palermo for curators, writers, and editors. So, as I said, when we, do I do this right? I'm always like, yes, okay, so here you see, I already said this, we're looking into how can we recoin programs, people, partners, places, and what does that mean? In terms of, I keep it short because otherwise I'm easily continuing for an hour. In terms of programs, already in Manifesta 12 in Palermo, we understood let's say, the conceptual framework turning a city of mafia into a city of culture needed completely different tools. And that was the moment I introduced urban visions, meaning we wanted to map the city of Palermo far better than we used to do before. We did this also in Nicosia and in San Sebastian, but now we work together with Rem Koolhaas and Ippolito Pestellini far more in a holistic way, understanding the archives, the histories, the unspoken stories, the untold genealogies of each city, and combine them with a kind of urbanistic vision. Very important in this new conceptual framework for Manifesta is that we don't start appointing a curator. We work with a local team. 95% of our people are from the local context, and we change this methodology also to give these people a voice in the conceptual framework. So it's not only the curator, in our case it's called a creative mediator, but reviewing the canon and the way we want to mobilize people is also to change the model of the curator. What we did actually, and in the next, you see the photo of the same perspective we did in Pristina. What we found out, if you want to speak about programs, you always have to speak about people. Who are the people who make this program, and how do they come to their knowledge? Because we say Manifesta is a lot about knowledge production. What you see on this photo on the right side is a citizen consultation, which we organize with local associations in Marseille and in Pristina. This is the one in Pristina. And what we actually say is, before we start with a curatorial or creative framework, let's ask the citizens what they need from Manifesta. Let's ask the citizens what is the relevance of culture, art, urbanism, the future of their city, as they identify it. And this was introduced by David van Rijbroek, a culture philosopher in Brussels. And we worked with him in Marseille, where it fantastically was embedded in the entire process. Why? Because people had the idea that this model of a biennial with a monolithic curator flying in, telling everybody what to do, and then leaving again, didn't function in this whole context of Black Lives Matters, Gilets jaunes, and specifically in Marseille. We also implemented this in Pristina, where also we worked very much with a diversity committee. Kosovo has 5 national ethnic groups, the Albanians as a majority, but also the Serbians, Ascali, Turkish, and Roma. And it was very difficult for us, but also for our Albanian team, how to identify whose voices are we actually allowing to speak. And if we want to take this serious, are we telling people that you are allowed to speak, or are we working together with community leaders? And that's my first point. We appointed a diversity committee with the community leaders of this Ascali, Roma, Serbian, and they advise us not only in terms of how to incorporate, but also sometimes even what language to speak. And you see the sort of question I asked my team: how to interact, how to involve, how to advise, how to remember, how to continue. I can talk a lot about the diversity of audience, because also through these community leaders we were able to dive into a completely different audience. Normally the Manifesta audience is maybe 40-50% international, 50% of local. In Pristina, completely different. 80% local, 20% international. Why? Because it was the voices of the local communities. Plus, it immediately had repercussion also on the artistic programming, because from the 103 collectives, groups, social activists, artists, writers, philosophers, there were only 25 internationals. The rest were coming from Kosovo, but also from the whole Western Balkan. Creative mediators, a whole other chapter, I could talk about it for hours. Mediation school is maybe also something. We asked the community leaders, how can we tap into a language which those communities understand and will adapt and create an accessibility? And we started a mediation school in which the mediation tours were given, and maybe you experienced one, both in Serbian, Albanian, Turkish, and Roma. And that was very important, because otherwise these groups could not.
You have no idea! 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 Thank you. Bravo!
That's how we sometimes felt when entering into a Manifesta host city. And that also, this is Selma Selman, who is actually at the moment at the Rijksacademie in Amsterdam. But to represent those voices, this is another artist with whom we worked in a special developed center, which is called Center for Narrative Practice, the Storytelling Center. And OASA is the children's part of it. And this is Sami Mustafa, who created these workshops with children in fairy tales from my grandfather. How can the Roma community continue telling the stories of the past? Yes, I'm wrapping up. This is the OASA. This is another workshop of Bayram and Farija Mehmeti, two Roma artists whom we invited to do workshops and painting classes. Partners, one thing about partners, it's not always only about your audiences, your communities, the conceptual framework, the program. It is also with whom do you choose to work, and how can you create partnerships in both content development as well as artistic partner developments, who could maybe have also a kind of sustainable context. And what I would like to highlight is I'm a tiny little bit proud of the fact that 2.5 years before we started the biennial, we found out there was not so much communication in between the countries in the Western Balkan. So we created a Western Balkan network of 11 countries amongst Serbia, Albania, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro, and they all participated. They worked together, but also participated in the Biennale. And one project I think was very beautiful is the subculture mapping. It's a series of publications in which associations and oral history practitioners wrote down the untold stories of underground movements in Tirana, Skopje, and Pristina. And it's, I think that was one of the projects which really worked very well, because Manifesta had this possibility, this time, this framework, and capacity to write, to help writing these histories. Also important, what sort of partners do you choose in civic debates? What partners do you want? As Manifesta needs to be an incubator for social change. As I already said before, decolonizing public space is important for us. And for the first time, that's also different than in other manifestas. We don't leave the city anymore. So in Pristina, it's not wrapping up, putting everything on transport. It's the first time Manifesta is able to sustain this Center of Narrative Practice. It will be secured for the next 4 years. Also the mediation school. And this is part of the Raumlabor Parliament. Also, the brick factory is going to be continue revitalized, and the Green Corridor, part of a greening and cleaning project Manifesta did. 2 tiny little sentences about places. Everything is, since you're nomadic, you need to investigate what is your home for the next 2 years. So we do this very far in advance. As you see here, these are the cities we're working. We are now in Pristina. We go to Barcelona, not to the city center, but to the metropolitan areas where there's nothing in culture. Then we go to Ruhr. And then there is this idea maybe to go to Ukraine in 2028. We hope to be allowed to be invited. And many people ask why to Ukraine, and I'm maybe allowed to say 5, then I will stop, 5 arguments which were mentioned. Why could a Manifesta in Ukraine in 28 maybe take place? I think fostering international networks, because the idea would be that all the former Manifesta host cities and some of their institutions team up with institutions in Ukraine, and maybe connecting the best practice partners in those cities in urbanism, architecture, conservation, education, and and stimulate cross-border knowledge production through social education practices on the principle of reciprocity. I think that's super important. It's also, I think, for Manifesta extremely important to focus on giving voice to minority in these disputed areas and emphasize on our role of being a social incubator in conflict zones. So I hope we're going to manage this. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we will continue talking about the perspective of Manifesta in Ukraine throughout these 2 days. I think it's one of the topics worth discussing in this context. I would like to invite Nanne to give your statement, your presentation. It's up to you if you want to stay here or you want to stand at the... It's up to you. Both. Sure, of course, yes.
Okay. Thank you. I think it's better to stand because I also brought some slides and actually from there I can't see very well. So otherwise I would have preferred to stand. So thank you very much, Tetyana, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for coming. And I also feel it's a great honor and also a pleasure to speak here, and just to see which directions. Okay. Yes. And while the previous speakers were talking, it occurred to me somehow that maybe, as different from the others, I'm here not standing as a representative of an institution, but rather as someone who has a complex relationship, let's say, to Documenta. This year I celebrate my 20th anniversary with Documenta. I first worked for Documenta 11 and then for 12, and then I researched it, and now, as Tetyana already said in the introduction, I also have been working with Nora Sternfeld and others in the founding of the Documenta Institute. But today I think I'm here also to speak about more recent work, and this is older, or these are slides that stem from older research of mine, which is very much engaged with the social reproductive functions of exhibitions and of curating, and I often looked at these from the perspective of the feminization of gender and power, and also the way how curating can be used as soft power. And I just found this slide from a very old presentation of mine, but somehow it reminded me of very different times, 2014, and in those times I chose it to be part of my presentation because I felt it was the smiling face of the defense minister who was there inaugurating a kindergarten. So it was actually the Foucauldian notion of biopower, focusing on the living and the birth and the making living, and not so much on death and necropolitics. And I think, of course, these things have changed dramatically also since then. And there's a relation to my more recent research, which is about the Nazi continuities at Documenta, which I started in 2018, and the show that Tetyana showed at the beginning was very important for us at the Deutsche Historische Museum in Berlin, because when I, at the beginning, stumbled over the wordings in the Documenta catalogs of 1955, somehow, and said, okay, maybe we have to take a closer look at these things because there's some folkish, ethnic language that might be traces of some Nazi continuities. People wouldn't believe me or would think this is somehow unthinkable because Documenta is an exhibition that stands for the opposite, right? It stands for the good Germans. It stands for the new, like the new Germany that has, that's dealing with its past, like Vergangenheitsbewältigung. So somehow these suspicions that we had somehow just didn't match the fairy tale of Documenta. That is, I think, at least in Germany, still very powerful. Maybe I also have to add, after I heard my previous speakers, that it's also important to, like, if you speak about Documenta as opposed to the Venice Biennale, that Documenta is proud of not being organized according to national pavilions. So somehow also my own education within Documenta somehow in the past 20 years was somehow from a post-national perspective, where at least I was raised in this maybe utopia that nationality shouldn't matter so much anymore. And of course, now we also see that maybe things change again. I think you can also very much feel that if you look at the issue of decolonization or decoloniality in biennials and how it is treated. Maybe we can discuss these things later. Sometimes I feel it's quite uncanny also, this return of nationality and nationalism. But basically I was raised in the myth of Documenta that was somehow post-national socialist, post-nationalist, perhaps even in the past 20 years, but which was also a fairy tale, because this idea of Documenta being like the good denazified Germany and the modern art that was shown there was like anti-Nazi, whereas like the realist art was either Nazi or also bad. Soviet realism somehow was so successful that people couldn't imagine that there are actually quite a lot of Nazi continuities in Documenta, and these are some of the texts I have written, and I'm currently working on this working project that is titled Documenta as a Haunted House, also because this notion of haunting, again, allows us to also think about these things performatively, so that we are all ghosts. That's why I put my cap there ostensibly, because we also curated an exhibition last fall, like before Documenta 15 started, about like how we are all ghosts and haunted by the legacies of colonialism and Nazism, and somehow that it is very important not just to point fingers to others, but always also somehow to make an effort to decolonize ourselves and our own thinking and our own histories, our own epistemologies, but also the economies. And I just couldn't resist putting this in, because this picture was only recently, like a month or maybe 6 weeks ago, released, and this is what the Friedrichsjanum looked like at the Reichs, what they are called, Tage in, I think it's 37. So there were a lot of swastikas on the fronts, and this is a bit, oh no, I return, this is a bit polemic, of course. This is Documenta 2 with like also red flags, and somehow whenever we looked at this picture before, of course we had these ideas in mind, and now somehow there are more obvious correspondences for some reason. Okay, I just put this in because we have the Documenta catalog and the Siegfried Lenz German lesson. It's a book that was also published in Western Germany after the war, and it basically tells us the same story that Documenta tells, which is a fairy tale and not a true story, but people took it to be true, which basically heroizes a modern artist modeled on Emil Nolde, as a sort of framing him as a resistant to the Nazi regime, while in fact he was really sympathetic with the Nazis and one of the first members of the party and a heavy anti-Semite. So there were on all kinds of layers in culture in post-war West Germany, like this storytelling, this reiteration of the fairy tale of the good Germany that somehow got incorporated so strongly that it's really hard actually to kind of unlearn these stories also. And I can really also in our project we make the experience that for people, especially maybe like previous generations, it's really hard to face that these stories or truths somehow come down or have to be rethought. There you have the label of one of the Nazi journals for which some of the Documenta founders wrote in the 1930s, and which basically, like the same text or the same text fragments are reiterated in the introductions, especially by Werner Haftmann for the Documenta catalog. So it's almost the same narratives with slight alterations, like what used to be particularly German now was particularly democratic. So it's basically often just a switch from something that was Germanic, now it's democratic. And I put these in because I don't know if you can read it. It's the credits of the financing partners of the first Documenta, and there, of course, are also some companies that profited from the war, from war production, but also from experimentation with humans or from forced labor. Or also expropriation and Aryanization. So basically the money for Documenta came also from more problematic resources, and there is this cultural miracle in West Germany, which is actually maybe not a miracle because it's pretty obvious that where the resources came from. And this is a work by one of the students I worked with for our exhibition last winter, Denis Lebediev, and he made these little turtles out of remnants of things, bombed buildings in Kassel. And it's basically about male fantasies, and I don't know the English word right now for the Körperpanzer, but it's like it's basically this idea of masculinity, of shielded masculinity, of unvulnerability, shattered to pieces, and this idea, I think, the soldierly, strong masculinity that is shielded off and protected is something that also uncannily re-emerges in these times again, and which is also something that maybe relates to these two slides. One is again a facsimile from one of the articles I just mentioned from 1934 by Werner Haftmann about Geographie und unsere besondere Kunstsituation, and in that text he is like utterly anti-democratic and somehow voices some ideas that might be discussed, and this is a project that is still something I want to work on. I had hoped I would be further for today because I think there is also a tradition of Eurasianism that resonates with ideas of Alexander Dugin somehow in Documenta, for instance, in the writings and thinkings of Werner Haftmann, but also in the writings and thinkings of Joseph Beuys, which is why I put the work, or like a picture of Beuys on his work of Eurasia here. And both of them are like, there's this emphasis on freedom, and it's an ungrounded freedom. It's a freedom that is total, that is toxic. It's actually an idea of toxic freedom, which is a male freedom of superiority that they often also relate to Machiavelli's writings, and basically which doesn't care, that is ungrounded, and which also maybe irresponsible, because it's a freedom that just takes what it wants and does what it wants. And this idea of toxic freedom, at least in German cultural politics, you also have it quite often now, that people actually call for it, and that it's a kind of freedom without responsibility also. So it's basically a kind of reactionary call, or like kind of that you don't want your freedoms to be restricted by sensitivities towards racism or anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. You feel kind of cancelled all the time. So basically these ideas are there. And maybe, I don't know how I'm doing with time, but just a little bit. Okay, because I just brought this in, because there's also this reference to the idea of healing and how exhibitions can be healing for the last Documenta and for the first Documenta. And again, healing, I think, is something that has become quite trendy recently, also in curatorial discourses, but it's also quite an ambivalent concept that also reaches back to folkish nationalist narratives from the 19th century. So it's very important to look at both sides of this concept, and also what role it played, for instance, in German folkish art history from people like I forgot his name. Anyway, but that was also implied by Werner Haftmann and Beuys, and also something that you can find in Nietzsche and that you can find in all kinds of people. So it's really ambivalent, because, and also of course with regard to German history, I think it's quite impossible to heal what has happened. And I think this yearning for healing and this yearning for wholeness maybe is also something that is, again, something that we can see today on a global scale maybe, and this dealing with anxieties due to estrangement or alienation, I think is a motif that I notice again today, and like kind of sometimes also it feels like history repeats itself in the ways how people try to deal with alienation or try to get rid of it by healing, for instance. Yeah, and I mean, these are just this idea of collectivity against this hyper-masculine individuality with toxic freedom, and these are just some slides from projects we did last year, and the cap that you see with Make Documenta Great Again was also something we came up last year, basically because of the way that people were like uneasy to deal with Documenta's history or new historiography or its revisions, because somehow there was always this like holding on to Documenta, to the myth of Documenta as a great idea, and this wanting to go back to it, or this defense against like kind of looking at it more critically. And of course, after this Documenta, it has also gained a new meaning, because many people, again, often from a very individualistic perspective, somehow feel that Documenta has to be made great again. And maybe I leave it at that. I brought some more slides of the projects, but I think that's just a perfect ending. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nanne. Thank you. Yeah, we'll definitely continue. There are a lot of interesting topics. And I would like to invite Joanna Warsza to speak about your project. And sure, absolutely, as you wish. Yeah, there are mics over there.
Thank you so much, Tetyana, for the invitation in this context. It's an honor to be part here with you, with the Ukrainian Pavilion. Actually, sorry, I didn't prepare slides because we're in Venice and the pavilion is only 500 meters from here. So then somehow, and I will show it to you tomorrow, and everyone is welcome to also come around 12 for a guided tour. But of course, the topic of decoloniality, on one hand, is something that has been on my mind in the context of Eastern Europe. For some years, I've been thinking and also working on some exhibition, for example, at Sabi Contemporary in Berlin, looking at how, when we speak about Eurocentric, for example, how mostly we speak about Western Europe, you know, and how us, let's say, cultural producers from Eastern Europe can a little bit show the difference. Now, after the 24th of February, I think it is evident, but it hasn't been in the last years, you know, how Europe has been divided when it comes to the colonial legacy. I'll read a fragment of one text I wrote for MoMA last year about this topic, and then I'll say a few words about the Polish Pavilion. In the endless Zoom calls, one has to navigate the time zones. Setting your meeting to Central European time, you see many cities listed, including Amsterdam, Stockholm, and Rome, but almost never Tirana or Warsaw, which were part of the former Eastern Bloc. If you schedule a call in Riga, Helsinki comes up as your time mark. And this is not only tech giants in Silicon Valley who see Europe through Western prism, but also many critical thinkers. Eastern European historical and symbolic position as a part of Europe, but not exactly, that is, its relative absence in discourse equating Europe with Western Europe, complicates the asymmetry of so-called global North and global South, to which some people propose adding the global East. As much as Europe's violent colonial mindset has been shared and embodied across the whole continent, its colonial past has not, because the fundaments of it were exercised locally, mostly in its semi-peripheral eastern and southern parts, which submitted to Western exploitation and then perpetuated further. Thus, Eastern Europe shares the condition of being complicit in the system of imperialism and colonization, while at the same time serving as a first training ground for its implementation. In effect, it has been both racializing and racialized. Hungarian geographer Zoltán Ginelli, who founded the Facebook group Decolonize Eastern Europe, defines various local dilemmas. Eastern Europeans historically have been racialized as non-white, while they themselves have produced a semi-peripheral position which was not quite white. They supported various colonial projects, and at the same time the region was seen as a colonizable space. They were often cast as non-white but wanted the benefits of whiteness. This complex idiosyncrasy might be one of the reasons why Eastern Europe sometimes falls out of the global picture, and especially the US-grounded debates concerning the Eurocentric perspective, which might be better described as Westercentrism or Occidentalism. It was already materially diagnosed by Immanuel Wallerstein through this world system theory, which points to the center-periphery divide of the continent, and yet there is also a symbolic dimension to it, for the West has controlled most of the discursive tool and theory and history and art. We believe that simply applying those tools in Eastern Europe is not enough. The ideas of Eurocentrism and European whiteness need to be decentered. The European critical spectrum calls for more in-depth analysis of a vernacular experience in the post-communist and post-socialist legacy across the eastern part of the continent, including, for example, the relations between Russia and Ukraine, and the participation of ex-Yugoslav countries in non-aligned movement, the inner relations between the older and newer countries, and the long and complex coexistence with the Jewish and Roma populations. It's just, you know, just part, it would have to be rewritten a little bit with the current reality, but it's part of this complex dilemmas of how, in a way, the colonial minds, even if the colonies is maybe something Western Europe has outsourced out there, but how the colonial mindset and the imperial mindset and these tools, the perpetuation of them, actually can be also applied, of course, to what Russian empire and Russia today has been performing, and also how Poland has been also performing the colonial mindset in Ukraine, right? And how the Eastern European region have been exercising it locally. So now, with this in mind, also together with Wojciech Szymański, co-curator of Polish Pavilion, we thought to apply for the competition for the Polish Pavilion. It's actually pretty, I'm not sure it's the case in Ukraine, but in Poland since 20 years it has been a pretty transparent and democratic way where every professional can apply. We both were first curators in Poland who have worked with Małgorzata Mirgatas, the Roma artist, Polish Roma artist, outside of any ethnographical context. So she has been for many years, even if she's a professional artist, she has finished, she has graduated from Krakow Art Academy. She has been for many years invited mostly in this kind of, you know, ethnographical context. And so we applied and were lucky to win the competition and be able to present a first Roma women in any national pavilion ever in the history of 127 years history of the Venice Biennale, which we're very happy with. And of course, she also, what she does is very much a decolonizing biennial strategy. And why is it so? Well, first of all, is because it's post-national in some sense. Of course, the Venice model with the national pavilions, it's to a degree obsolete model. The biennials today, you mentioned there are so many biennials. The biennials today, as we do them, as we practice them, it's not something we learned from Venice model. It's something we rather learned from biennials such as Havana Biennial in '84, that was calling itself peripheral biennial, that was completely abandoning the national idea, that was presenting artists both from diaspora and the local artists, that was kind of not taking Eurocentrism into account, but everything else. And in a way, we still try to produce critical discourse in Venice, not because of Venice legacy, but because of this other work that has been done in these other places. So Małgorzata Mirgatas also inscribes herself very much in the fact of how can you use a national pavilion for transnational discourse. And Roma is the biggest minority in Europe. It inhabits Ukraine, it inhabits Russia, it inhabits Poland. I mean, the people are really transnational. And that was for us also part of the colonization, that many people from many countries can come and find a piece of themselves in this pavilion. You know, for example, as I'm teaching in Swedish, many of my Swedish colleagues would come and see part of her stories from Swedish culture, like Rosa Taikon, Katarina Taikon, and you know, bits and pieces. And in some sense, it's in this sense that would for us be a decolonial. And of course, there is a need of self-determination, and yet there is a need for platforms where this kind of transnational discourse can be presented. That's one part of this, the coloniality of biennials. The second is maybe also how she's, while using patchworks, very often you see the elements that don't fit and yet coexist together, right? So that speaking of overcoming conflicts, of being anti-xenophobic, anti-militaristic in some sense, she's in the materiality of how she works with the clothes and with second-hand clothes. She would put things that, let's say, normatively don't fit together, yeah, the dots and stripes, and yet this creates some kind of an effect in which symbolically one can think we don't have to be alike, but we can coexist. There is this kind of peaceful message that she brings to it. What else would be important to say? Yes. Of course.
I've seen your presentation. Congratulations again. It's an amazing presentation. I saw it 3 times, and what I was thinking, this kind of transnational identity fits very well in this, bubble of Venice with privileged visitors. But I couldn't find anything on internet. How was the reaction in Poland about this? Was there a discourse rising from your presentation, or how was the perception?
Well, first of all, she says, for example, my feminism doesn't shout, it tells stories. So she obviously, is not on the right-wing side of the political spectrum, quite the opposite. But she has also been chosen by the jury, which was 50-50. So it's not a position that would arise a huge protest in Poland. Actually, the opposite. In some sense, it's conciliatory. It's conciliatory also because it's, I guess, deeply anti. It's peaceful in a way. It's very peaceful. So there was, I guess she has put divides together to a degree, and the current director of National Gallery, when he was here at the opening, and of course we are, disagreeing on many political points, but when he was here at opening, his whole speech was about the number of Ukrainian refugees in Poland. And he was saying, by this day, there is such and such a number of Ukrainian refugees. And we were listening to him and we were thinking, there is nothing we can disagree with. Actually, after 24th of February, we found ourselves a little bit on the same side, on the solidaric side, and through this pavilion too, in a way. So, I mean, of course, it's very tragic that this needs to happen, but still, that was also an effect of this pavilion.
Thank you, Joanna, and everyone else. You already know the Anastasia's statement and background on the topic, and we can proceed with the questions. One of the issues that raised the question of decoloniality in particular is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and we definitely understand that the essence of this war is neocolonial. So that's why we want to emphasize the necessity, the urge for decoloniality in all the discourses, including culture. It's so important for us to raise this question and to find as many answers as possible until, we still have this opportunity and we finally have this, the ability for our voice to be heard. We had different topics throughout this program. We spoke about the art histories that are falling between the cracks, that are falling outside the main narrative. We were talking about art which is a target of the war and which is weaponized by the war. But frankly, I think from all the topic that we touched, the decolonization of the biennials seems to be very hardly spoken about. I really find it one of the most difficult ones to narrate about, to talk about, and it feels the discomfort of this question is kind of very feasible and even, kind of physically felt. My first question to you would be, Is there an urge to decolonize biennials? How far are we in that process? And why is it difficult to talk about decolonization of the biennials? Whoever wants to start.
There is actually this term coined by Oliver Marhart, among others, I think, also one more person, biennials of resistance. So yes, there are biennials and biennials. There are in the planet around 300 biennials as far as I know at the moment, more or less. And of course, there are biennials whose agendas is, for example, apparently Singapore biennial, pure branding and neoliberalization and tourist industry. But there are biennials that actually, through certain education, through culture, try to, very often in post-conflict zones, right? I mean, Documenta, of course, was also such an attempt at the beginning, right? And here I could bring another biennial from Kosovo, where I'm also involved, the Autostrada Biennial. It's an initiative from young artists, post-war initiative by young artists in Prizren, second city of Kosovo, who took over a NATO hangar, so a place where German peace forces were stationing for many, many years. But of course, the area of the city, which is a military zone, that nobody can have access to. And what does it mean to take a hangar and then take this hangar, turn this hangar into a studio place, in kind of a resourceful place for making projects, for mediating, for communicating through art, overcoming isolation through art. This is what I would call biennial of resistance. This is a decolonized biennial, because it's using maybe some glamour from what biennial offers, because if you just call it a culture house, might not be enough for drawing a lot of attention. But if you call it a biennial, you already treat yourself very seriously. You have colleagues abroad, many people, you put yourself on the map, so you know why you are doing, why you are calling this a biennial. It's also a kind of trick. While on the other hand, what you do through it is actually, soften, demilitarize, repair, reconcile in the post-war society. So that's, I think there's, as I said, biennials and biennials. So it's important to think, how can we resist, yet using the infrastructure of the biennial?
But don't you think that biennials are completely overrated conceptual framework? Because as you already say, there's 300 different biennials and maybe thousands of different museums. I mean, we can hardly keep on using this term, because Documenta, Manifesta, Venice, these are three completely different institutions, like you have thousands of different museums. I actually, in 1987, I went from Soviet Union to Cuba. It's another story why I did that. But I was actually trained by Liliana Yanes in the Habana Biennale. And that was for me a source. And I think biennial at that time in the 80s, it's already 40 years ago, that was really an example of resistance, because the biennial was for artists from the third world, we used to use that word at that time, who didn't had any, let's say, positioning in the international media, institutional-wise, biennials, or any kind of framework. And Liliana Yanes, the founder of the Habana Biennial, said, if I am able to occupy 0.01% of international media to give a platform to those artists, I already won something. That was in the 80s. I'm sometimes thinking, okay, a lot has happened. Indeed, there are places where voices of resistance can take place. But couldn't it be a better idea to completely erase the notion of biennials? Because I think that the notion of biennials at this moment has deteriorated it, because let's say 90% of those institutionalized biennials are mostly cultural marketing instruments fed by commercial power structures, initiated by a privileged sort of few. And if not, and I know this myself, those others, Habana Biennale, Johannesburg, Malmo. There were a couple of at the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. Because of that resistance notion, it was almost impossible to maintain. And that is, let's say, the contradictio in terminis, because the commercial world is not interested in those biennials in resistance. So even being in this world, for 40 years, I can hardly imagine how this could somehow, the biennials as such, being decolonized. I think in my personal view, it would be better to speak about institutions, because also Venice is an institution in itself, like a museum. And to come back to Anastasia, what you said, I'm really scattered about the idea that some of the other institutions called museum, and let's put it, the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, who's owning so many Malevich. Is there a movement, and it doesn't matter for me if it's in biennials or in museums, is there a movement which you signal in those institutions to decolonize the collections, to do historical justice to, for example, the Malevich collection?
We're switching from one question to another question. I remember that question, I will return to it, but I would like to still have Nanne respond to my question.
Yeah, and maybe I think it's also a response to all of you in a way, because like this notion of, it just occurred to me that maybe also that it's not so easy to differentiate between biennials of resistance or other biennials, because I think mostly, and that's maybe also one of the difficulties, you have like in each institution or biennial, you have like both, right? You cannot separate into good and bad ones, but then maybe you have certain critical impulses that might become turned against themselves, or maybe you have good intentions, but the effects are totally different, or maybe you are in a very complex political situation where you don't even know what ends your own activism might serve in the end. So it's really, really tricky and complicated. And then, of course, also the other way around, maybe things that seem to be more reactionary and problematic then also have like good side effects and things that might happen that were not intended and actually have more emancipatory outcomes. So I think it's really difficult to differentiate between these two things, and maybe it's quite important to also look at like not just intentions of actors who, of course, always claim to be doing good, but also at actually what comes out of it and what happens and what are the effects. And I also wanted to bring to the table another question, because, of course, you asked about the decolonization of biennials themselves, but then also I think because decolonization has become such a strong or like omniscient content of biennials, I really start to wonder what that does, because for me it starts to sometimes feel, I don't know, I don't even have words for it yet, but it sometimes feels so repetitive, and that it starts to really become an empty signifier, or emptying itself out and maybe loses its power. I'm not so sure. So I think this question of how you can decolonize actually, and what's maybe so difficult about it, is a very good and interesting one. Also maybe because it really forces us to think about how much the idea of biennials or institutions or exhibitions or curating or representation or actually art making are also problematic always in some ways. So it's really messy business, I think. And I think this question really points to this.
I want to thank you, Tetyana, for starting our discussion from this angle, because I totally agree that talking about the decolonization process in general and about the decolonization of biennials is a very hard and very harsh topic to discuss. But it's much easier to discuss it when being Ukrainian in 2022, because we are not just interested in talking about decolonization in the system of art. It means a word for us. We really need it very much. So it's much easier to start talking about it now. And I think that my point is that Ukraine now can be not only the reason of why all these important discussions started. We could be really important subject to initiate such discussions, to say some harsh things that not really can be accepted nice from the very beginning. But we can initiate these discussions. We can be like the facilitators of such discussions. We can be disruptors in many moments when it needs to be a disruptor for some changes to be started. So I think we really need to talk a lot about the decolonization, and we really need to do a lot in this direction. So thank you so much for this starting point of the discussion.
Well, we are disrupting. I mean, we are speaking about decoloniality at Venice Biennial, hosted by the Venice Biennale.
We are really disruptors.
And Venice Biennale is still based on the National Pavilion system, despite the fact that we are kind of understand the urge to change that. But if there is a ways, if there are ways to change it, we'll hopefully also refer to today and maybe tomorrow also, as we will speak about the Estonian pavilion, which is in the Dutch pavilion, which is about an Indonesian situation, you know, so how we can actually break that system, the narrow system of national pavilions, and kind of open up the doors to something else, and what actually happens when we do it, and if, you know, if that way is allowed to do, and if that's the way to proceed. Quickly responding to the question that you raised, of course, decoloniality involves all types of institutions of power and museums, as well as places where the knowledge is produced and communicated, and the knowledge about art. And there is a lot of work done with the museums, and actually just 3 weeks ago, during our previous conference, we had a person, a curator from the Stedelijk Museum, and we discussed the issue of decoloniality around Malevich and avant-garde in particular. And I have to say that Stedelijk is really doing well, because they don't use the term Russian avant-garde anymore. That's their position.
What anymore?
Anymore, yeah. Well, I mean, you have to start with something, and it's good. It's the position. They already, you know, they stated it, and I'm sure that the other ways and other steps will follow for sure. Avant-garde in different countries, or avant-garde in different context, cultures. So they just refer to it as avant-garde in Poland, for example, yeah, or in Ukraine. Yeah, so no more Russian avant-garde for the Stedelijk, at least.
Finally.
Finally. As well as museums, for example, refuse from referring to kind of national identity of artists, so they don't say Russian artist Kazimir Malevich anymore. Most of them, let's say MoMA, who was also part of the conference in September, they also refused to identify artists by their nationality. So I mean, there are already tendencies and some steps in the museums, but as you know, that's kind of a long story. It's like people have their working hours and they cannot do everything overnight. So I mean, they are coming there. It's developing, and I mean, the Ukrainian Institute, we are doing a lot with the museums. We are having a series of talks, discussions, workshops, helping museums to actually get aware of the problem, because majority of Western museum, they don't see the problem. They are used to looking at Eastern Europe through the eyes of the metropole, mostly the Russian metropole. So they don't even see kind of, you know, they lack sensitivity to see the problem in this disregard, in this overlooking of other cultures that were in the shadow of the empire. And sorry, I just took too much time as a moderator to it's your statement. Yes, yeah, part of my statement. Well, I did one at the beginning also. Okay, what did I want to ask? You disrupted my plan, my power of my power of a moderator. Well, but it's. Yeah, decolonize the moderator. I mean, Documenta tried to decolonize curators. Yeah, not allowing any curators in. Next step is decolonizing moderator. Yeah, Decoloniality belongs to everyone. But I would like to suggest, if you wish, if you may, to talk about actually the future of biennials. Like, if we really want to get rid of this obviously imperial legacy, because the biennial as the structure, as the stage basically for someone to speak, and everyone wants to get the mic and speak. And as Anastasia told in her presentation, for Ukraine it was the matter of actually existence, to be present, because it was the only way to kind of legitimate that we exist, we have our own culture. Please take us, give us a space at the biennial, because that's the way kind of to state that you are your agency and expose yourself. If we don't want to keep that this way, to have like one point where everyone is who exists is allowed to speak, but have a different structure, what kind of structure do you think this institution or this type of relationship can take? If we don't even want to use the word biennial anymore.
Yeah, let's stop that. Yeah, that's already fantastic to stop the use. Well,
let's invent a new name.
That's also very blurry. Well, I use institution because maybe this is also coming back to the example which was stated before, the Dutch exchange, the biennial with the pavilion, which is built by Rietveld as one of the few first pavilions, I think in 1914, together with Russia and Belgium. But there was a lot of criticism in the Netherlands. So that's also how does decolonizing work? And that's one of my question for Poland, because the main criticism was not about the exchange. The main criticism was, and this is all about awareness and knowledge production, and I don't think it matters if this awareness, historical awareness, knowledge production in a historical context. The main criticism was, how for Christ's sake is it possible that Estonia comes up with this colonial perspective of Indonesia, which, like a Belgian person, this David van Rijbroek, needed to write the historical analysis of the Dutch imperial colonial 400 years, which is called Revolutie. Not a Dutch historian there to do. So this is like a beautiful gesture, but content-wise, it had a completely wrong impact. Content-wise, there was like even a hesitation and a resistance. Why does another East European, there was even denigration. Why do they need to attach this and attract this subject instead of a responsible Dutch institution like the Stedelijk Museum or the Rijksmuseum later did that? So there was like resistance. It's all based on a lack of knowledge and a lack of awareness how, even in my own circle of historians and art historians, if I said the last half year that Malevich is not per se a Russian artist, absolutely nobody is aware. So it's also a lot about how can we generate, I'm trying to do this within Manifesta, how can we generate within any institution, being it a biennial or an autostrada, generate knowledge and do research and disseminate this research in a certain context. And my personal issue is, how can you make this research accessible for large audiences? Because it would be interesting if we, let's say the international art world, understands these topics. But for me, is it, how come the Dutch audience even doesn't speak about the Indonesian issue? And how come that there is not an immense discussion in the Netherlands about the appropriation of Malevich? Not even to say, how did we arrive? How does this collection arrived in the Netherlands? So from my point of view, how can we stimulate, how can we care that awareness, knowledge production is being stimulated, is being developed from a variety of different institutions.
If I may just ask if I understand you correctly, so you mean the biennial should be transferred into art education institution?
It doesn't mean, I mean, it's not only about representation, it's also about knowledge production, research, education, mediation. What I do think is lacking here at the Venice Biennale is that there is a lot of knowledge production, but how is it disseminated? How is it made accessible for larger audience than maybe the professionals and the collectors who are walking around? So I think there is a potential project for many different institutions. My entire mediation school team went to the Documenta, and they were extremely excited to see it, but they were also tiny little bit disappointed that in such a complex conceptual framework, there were hardly any long-term mediation initiatives, creative mediators initiatives, while this is alienating certain audiences which could otherwise be attracted, especially with the budgets. I mean, we have tiny little budgets, but with a budget of 45 million euros, these kind of initiatives would be, or a permanent research institution which maybe creates a context in which all these works or these kind of initiatives, like in the Documenta, could be disseminated for a larger audiences, would be. Is that more clarifying? Yeah, thanks.
Okay, may I feel invited to speak to this, maybe? Yeah, I mean, and I don't. I mean, I wish I had the other head with me, but which would make me even more Miss Documenta. No, and of course it wasn't my Documenta, and I'm not a representative of Documenta, and I'm also not here to defend Documenta in any way. It just made me think about a couple of things, because I mean, we basically, like 2 weeks ago, we had the final conference of a larger project in Kassel, which was actually the also like basically posing this question, like working on the structures, working on the infrastructures, and how also in the process of like building this Documenta Institute, how not to step into the traps of reproducing certain colonial structures while with good intentions, right? Because I mean, also education, of course, I mean, exhibitions have always been educational institutions, and in the life reform movements in Germany, Langbehn, the guy's name whom I've forgotten like earlier, he was very much into museum reform and like kind of making it more approachable for larger audiences. And of course you also have the idea of the Volk, which is not only a folkish notion, but also this idea of the people and the education of the people. So again, there is an uncanny, like it can go into several directions, but I think really what makes this question so difficult is like, how can we think about these things in terms of different really like basically the question of your book, right? Like of different ways of doing these things, not just filling in different contents, and also not maybe just broadening audiences, because that of course can also become paternalistic to some degree, or somehow also be an expansion of colonialism in some way, if you know, it just happens. Like I think it happens to me all the time. I constantly stumble over things where I reproduce certain infrastructures and ideas and mindsets, and maybe also ways of acting, ways of speaking that I don't actually want to. So I think it's really work on different layers actually, and yeah, I mean, how, like, if we have biennials, because biennials are quite specific with their histories also, and with their functions, and with that they have, and also with the audiences they draw. I mean, it's a really difficult question to really think about if we stick by the name of biennials, how to think about a future for them. I think it's really hard to think about it. Maybe it shouldn't be biennial any longer, because that of course suggests a certain rhythm and a certain temporality that can also have advantages and disadvantages. But then also the large-scale exhibition model, I think, is also something that is like I mean, speaking about audiences, like professional audiences, it's just such a, I mean, you have to be able to afford to travel, you have to be able to afford to spend a lot of time and money to get to places. And I mean, yeah, so like, of course, then you have biennials or large-scale exhibitions that are really like that maybe people just stumble into because you have, like, I just came from Istanbul, you have open, you know, like open access, so people just happen to come in and then they have their own experiences. But of course, that's a very, like a different, again, maybe not always intentional experiences.
But maybe just an immediate reaction. We are forced to do a lot of research before we enter in a city as a nomadic biennial. So in Kosovo, but a local organization interviewed 400 different people on basis of what is the relevance of art and culture for your community and for you as an individual? And do you sometimes go to museums or etc.? Well, the main nominator was that the relevance of culture, if they had to institutionalize, was the mall, the shopping mall. So that was really for us a very, let's say, disappointing and very serious outcome, which also, if you dig deeper into why this is that all the museums are not attractive or not really interesting as institutions for larger audience because of the language, because of the stories. There's nothing which people can identify with, besides that they are even physically not really. Further, all the institutions, cultural institutions like the Hifzi Süleymani libraries, which were all over Kosovo, have been closed. Because second, they said the cultural relevance of what an institution could mean for us is it was the library. So that's also where, that we listened very well to this outcome, because many people said creating stories, telling our own stories is actually the first relevance of how we perceive culture. This is why Otherwise, or the Center for Narrative Practice, in a new format, it's about podcast making, it's about radio making, it's about animation, came actually and out of this research. And sometimes people say, how come that Manifesta as an institution, we have somehow an institution, we are commissioning this research, and why are the curators not doing it? I can't give an answer. The only thing is, I realized because of this nomadic origin, maybe if we were always in Kassel, we wouldn't have been forced to do it. Because of the nomadic origin, we need to map and identify and research who are living here, what is the history, what are the stories to be told, how can people be approached, and what is the relevance and the interest of local communities, and how can something as a biennial or an Autostrada tap into it. I think Autostrada is doing this also via these workshops and education models, etc., which is quite novel in terms of this biennial landscape.
I just wanted briefly to return to the question of the privilege regarding the biennial, because it's not only the privilege of having time and money, but sometimes the issue of visas is the obstacle. For example, at Documenta, the majority of artists were from the so-called Global South, and they needed visa to get, and some of them never got their visa, so they never saw their work. They were not able to come to Kassel and see how it looked like. So it was kind of, I see as a very critical point, that this is a certain, let's say, show off when we say, like, we point the light to the overlooked the Global South artist, but then they don't have the access themselves to see it, and then it seems like it's not for them. Actually, because they're not allowed in. It's for us to kind of feel okay and nice because we did something nice for them, those people somewhere far away that are not allowed in, you know, but we kind of paid our tribute to, and we can go on like doing our white people stuff on and on. Sorry, I know you don't want to kind of protect Documenta, but I'm just like sharing my perspective and what I was able to see. And, you know, like, maybe that would sound like a compliment to Manifesta, but Manifesta worked with local artists mostly, and they were all there. They were working in their home places with their context, delivering it for their own people, and it was kind of more natural way, you know, like to do this.
But I completely agree, and I think you also face this when working in Kosovo, that I mean, not only for my team, I mean, I'm starting crying when I'm telling this. We organized when we were leaving, when we're closing Manifesta 13 in Marseille, we organized that 10 people from the Pristina team could come for 3 months to work in Marseille in the Biennale context, but also working with the visa were arranged, and the moment they were at the airport here in Pristina, the COVID broke out again and the lockdown started, so their trips were cancelled, which sounds for us, privileged people, oh, fine, a trip is cancelled. For Kosovar people, it's extremely difficult, not only in terms of methodology, but also in terms of economical issues to acquire a visa. The only thing what we could do is, and I know it's naive and maybe inefficient, I initiated a statement during the press conference that we call for visa liberalizations, and what we did is we invited 30 journalists from all over the world to come to Kosovo and to talk to the Prime Minister and to talk to the President, to talk to the... And let's say 90% of those journalists from The Economist, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, have never heard about the fact that there is this visa restrictions. They were all like sort of stupefait, and we're now calculated in, we have like 1,000 whatever press clippings, and we're calculating now in how many of those press clippings visa liberalization or the unfair restrictions of visa are mentioned. I know it's naive and it's very inefficient, but this is the only thing I thought practically what we could do. And now the next thing is what we are trying to do is like invite as much as possible Kosovo artists and cultural workers also to the next editions.
I just wanted to add, like one model also came to my mind, the Ghetto Biennale, that was a documenter. I mean, I collaborated with them, and they actually, kind of because they couldn't travel and couldn't get visas, they just created their own Biennale in the Port-au-Prince ghetto in Haiti. And then it was basically also like turning certain like power relations upside down in interesting ways, and or confronting like these like traveling art world with the local art makers, and also like very different ideas about what art is and what art making is and why we are doing it. So I think that is maybe one idea of what could happen. And also because I think in many of the larger or more known biennials also now you have a lot of collaborative projects that try to engage, but then somehow I often have the feeling that they are very interesting projects, but somehow they still are being exhibited, and I often think maybe they shouldn't be. I often have the feeling it's projects that have their own logics and their own workings, and then as like one of the visitors who is flying somewhere to see a Biennale, I have a documentary or some pictures of people doing workshops and things, and wall text with a certain rhetoric. And it's just, I don't need to see this. And I often also don't really understand what's going on, and I think maybe it's just not meant for me. Maybe I should also accept that a lot of the things that might be important to do are just not for me to be seen. So maybe also kind of to undo, like, or to think about other ways of like curating these practices or events to like kind of think about our own imperial eyes and how much we still believe somehow these things are for us to be seen. And maybe that's also one of like the reactions of lots of critics of Documenta 15, which was really interesting and which was something that was, I think, just under discussed because of like anti-Semitism being so prominent. But I think there were also lots of reactions. I think it would be worthwhile to think more about also how displaced many people felt by looking at certain projects that had very different logics, but on the other hand also about somehow there was a clash of how this was mediated, and so maybe there would have been better ways to do it. But yeah, so this feeling of displacement, that feeling felt they had the right to, or like somehow this was for them, and now somehow they couldn't access it and felt disappointed or, disempowered by this, I think was really interesting to see, and maybe also to think about further in terms of how to translate certain practices into biennials or whatever you want to call it.
Well, just maybe a comment about do we need biennials? So, I think in the 80s, in the 90s, the art world needed them because they were, in a degree, machines of decolonization. Because the landscape was mostly museums, and landscape was mostly experts deciding on what is art and, fortresses of museums. So many biennials, not Venice, but the one I mentioned, actually contributed to the fact that art is not only an object exhibited in the space, that it's a language, that it can be a workshop, even, if I understand completely, very often it's not really what's, we can share or empathize with. But biennials enabled this, right? So not all of them, some of them, those biennials of resistance. And today Havana is absolutely not a biennial of resistance, but there was a moment when it was, right? So it kind of pushed it further. And so we did need them. Now we maybe are at the point of certain saturation of the biennials, but they exist. Now they are equally important as museums, And they kind of prove that there are other languages than just these walls and white cubes. So in a way we have needed them, and we might need them, but perhaps these new forms of resistance don't lie with the biennials so much anymore. There may be now other platforms, other languages that slowly appear. Documenta probably tried, to show us that those are the other models that go beyond display, that go beyond biennalization of the world. And this is, let's try to be part of it, and let's be curious and open to that, to this new thing. And just, sorry, one more comment about like tourism, and so taking Autostrada in Kosovo as an example. Yes, they started this biennial because precisely they need visa everywhere, so they want to have it at home, right? But also, I don't think they are expecting that now everyone goes on the plane and flies there. It's not about that. Also, a little bit, it's good to have some visitors, obviously, but it's also about creating some kind of, through this biennial platform, some kind of symbolic value about education, being conscious of it. And having audience locally, but also online. And this we know since Corona, we don't actually need to travel to all these places so much anymore. We might, but we also just are conscious about each other or are conscious about certain initiatives, and that's also fine, So that's.
Well, I think what you are saying about the biennials as a kind of useful tool, an instrument in the 80s and the 90s, which definitely was true. We hosted 2 or 3 weeks ago the International Biennial Association, and there, exactly as you say, maybe in some of the Western countries, this biennialization was somehow needed. Now it's happening in Pakistan, in Lesotho, in Latin America, and in other parts of the world where museums or institutions are not so easily be developed or founded, but where the biennial indeed is transgressing or creating cross-checking between different social activities, political activities, ethnic minorities, artistic productions, knowledge production. And I was like super inspired because I saw some the Karachi Biennial, for example, which were very much focused on that and which also seem to have a sustainability. And coming back to sustainability, my daughter asked me last week, how come that we had like 2 years pandemic and this crisis and you're still traveling? Because that is so not the idea anymore. And if I say I work for a biennial and that requires some sort of traveling, then she's really calling me, well, I don't want to repeat it, but the most irresponsible person to go for a conference flying to 3 cities in Europe is a no-go. So maybe some of our, let's say, representational part of the biennials, having these 100 exhibitions all over the world, is going to slowly fade away for a new format, an institutionalized online research and knowledge production, and maybe something in a different hybridization, because we, at a certain moment, our children are going to say, stop it. Don't go to 10 art fairs and 10 biennials a year, because we will not allow you to do this. Or is it too crazy to say?
It sounds perfect. Adding just a bit to what colleagues have already said, I should say that I'm totally agree with Joanna. In the case, we don't really need the discussion, do we need the biennials? Because the biennials could be very different. And if we are dreaming here, because that's actually what we're doing the last 15 minutes here, yeah? I would dream that biennials in the nearest future could be something more like the platforms, not white cubes with the art on the walls, but something more like the platforms with the wider tool of cultural, what a set of cultural tools, like game-changing, storytelling, knowledge producing, important discussions starting, and so on and so on. Through art exhibitions, through discussions, through educational and advocacy practices, and so on and so on. So that could be very different models for any global or local context, for any country, or without any frames for nationality or temporality or something like that. So I think that could be a nice dream about what biennials can be in the nearest future, just to be very brief.
And it also refers to the main topic of the biennial, the milk of dreams. So we actually had our dream on the future of the biennials.
We're practicing right now.
Yeah. Just a short reflection from me. I had the privilege, actually, to visit all major kind of biennials this year. I've been to Manifesta and Documenta, and this is my 5th time in Venice, and I've seen the Berlin Biennial. It's a privilege because I had the experience I would never have through online or reading a book. And this is still something that you cannot do without traveling and, traveling to like 4 cities in a few months and spending your time and someone's money for this. And this experience really takes you somewhere you haven't been before and gives you not just the knowledge, but the perspective from which you can find a position or a value, or you can really have, some kind of idea. Because on the paper, it can be one thing, but when you go to the city, to the context, you meet people, you talk to them, you really live through this experience, you can have a very different outcome than you would just think about when you just had this intellectual experience only without the emotional and personal experience. I'm just protecting the biennials a little bit, maybe still we need them for something. I would like to ask for the lights on the auditorium, and I would like to invite the audience to interrupt, maybe disrupt our conversation and come in with your questions, with your comments, with your ideas on the decolonial issue of the biennials. And I will ask Alessia or someone who has the microphone in the auditorium to see the hands. I already see the hand, but unfortunately I don't have the light to see the faces. So can we please have some light? Yeah, I'm just asking the staff to put some light on because it's kind of a difficult conversation.
Is the microphone on? Yes,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
Thanks.
My name is Mariana Grandic. I'm from the Human Rights Master in Vienna, and we are more or less the first master in the world set up at the intersectionality of human rights and art. And I'm a bit sorry, but I might have a difficult questions for Anastasia Platonova.
Here I am.
Thank you very much. For me, decoloniality is very much connected to nationalism. And my question is there a discourse in Ukraine at the moment to take the luxury to be against mainstream and to discuss the question of non-violent language in arts, even against the enemy, and questioning masculinity, which is a huge topic, and heroism, and how, or do you see that arts can somehow go along this fine line between nation building that is necessary for the Ukrainians and nationalism, not to swap into nationalism, which is a real big danger. And thank you, Hedwig, because Manifesta was for me a great example that a nation, I mean like Kosovo, succeeded not to jump into nationalism, but the state building process and national identity was a part of the whole interventions, but it wasn't, I at least didn't see any sort of nationalistic attitude there. So, and I know you are in a very difficult situation, but therefore I think maybe to start earlier to address these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question, for the series of the questions, actually. I would start step by step. First of all, if you're asking if there is any inner discussion in Ukraine now in finding or creating any non-violent language, speaking to Russians or about Russians, if I understood your question correctly, I wouldn't say it's a huge discussion. I would say it's a series of gaps in how we talk about it in Ukraine or outside of Ukraine, because it's pretty two different discourses and even languages. It's also a gap between how it's perceived by international people and by Ukrainians as well, how we are perceived and how all this issue is perceived in general. So from the very beginning of large-scale invasion of Russia to Ukraine, we've been hearing of how aggressive, traumatized, and so on we are talking about Russia and talking about what Russia is doing in Ukraine. And I completely disagree, because the people who say such things couldn't share our experience. But in the same time, we have our right to be aggressive and to be traumatized and to sound violent. It's okay to sound violent when you are a genocide survivor. It's okay, sorry. But we totally aware that we have to find our optics and to find some language how to talk about it internationally. And I would say we're in a process. I wouldn't say it's a huge discussion inside of Ukraine about it. It's like one of the few questions we have a total consensus in Ukrainian society about how to talk about it and how to perceive it. If we're talking about the question of nationalism, I would say that in Ukraine we understood nationalism much more closer to patriotism, not to from the dangerous perspective of what nationalism could be. Of course, due to the war, we have much more right views in Ukraine, and it's okay to have such a switch. But I think there are a few dangers of moving too far in right views. And I think there are some dangers which we have during the war and some dangers connected with this issue we would have after the war. I've got no easy answer on this question. I would say we're in the process of discussing it within Ukraine now. So it's just, I would say just take time.
Please, raise your hand and wait until you get the mic to speak.
Thank you so much. That was a fascinating discussion. My name is Maria Lanko. I'm actually one of the curators of Ukrainian Pavilion. So thank you for being here for us. I have two questions, one a technical one to Hedwig and another more complex one maybe you, Hedwig, and you, Joanna, could comment on. So the technical one is, Hedwig mentioned that in aspiring to go to Ukraine in 2028, if I'm not mistaken, an important direction to work on would be giving voice to minorities in disputed areas. I would like you just to unpack this term for me, because I don't really get what minorities in disputed territories mean. And the second one is related to the position of Kosovo in its region. And you mentioned that it was also a major topic for Manifesta to see the Kosovo as part of the Western Balkans. And like, how did you address the complexity and the sensitivity of its position in the region, where it remains the only country that's not recognized by half of the world, and neighboring Baltic countries as well, several ones of them, and still being in kind of slow-burning conflict with, you know, former colonizer? How do the Kosovans themselves, you know, feel themselves inside of this process of being seen a part of this region again? And if you, Joanna, could also talk about this kind of reconciliation process that the Biennial takes on. Do you mean that the reconciliation process in the whole region or within the different communities in Kosovo itself? And how does it practically happen? Thank you.
Well, it's many questions in one. The sensitivities and the sensibilities of these 5 ethnic communities living together are extremely complex. And we were with 55 team members, on which 6 internationals, the rest were Albanian. There were 2 Serbians, 1 Roma, and 1 Turkish person. We wanted to have the, let's say, what I try to say in program, people, places, etc. We want to equalize this, but that was already extremely difficult, even with the diversity committee, because, for example, there was Albanian spoken in the team, and the Serbians didn't feel very comfortable. So we changed to speaking all English. This is like a practicality, technical practicality, which was very difficult. Then there were problems with some people being allowed international traveling and other people not being allowed also within the groups with whom we worked, which created a kind of animosity in between members. There were many sensibilities about, I cannot talk hours of this, about how to produce, so which language do we speak and who is allowed to speak and who is appropriating this. So it was a lot also about, do we need to publish everything in Serbian, Albanian and Turkish, and do we have the economical resources, and if we do this. There was not even a consensus about some of the translations of Albanian texts into Serbian, and that caused an enormous amount of problem. We had problems at the end of Manifesta at the borders, which made people not being able to leave the country to Macedonia, to Serbia. So it was, and that's maybe what I mixed, or what was a little bit confusing, to deal in a contested area with an enormous amount, with different minority, is extremely complex. And it's also complex for outsiders, internationals, like the people in Manifesta, to appropriate these complexities. So it was mostly up to the team itself and this diversity committee how to interact. I give another example. We asked the Roma community, which live in Fuškosova and Krasanica, which is outside Pristina, close to the Serbian enclaves, to participate in many activities, and we never got an answer, and they didn't show up. But it was like they didn't have the money or the transport, or were not privileged enough to come even to the Biennale. Things which you even do not consider from your own perception in terms of mobility. So these kind of things we needed to find out during the Manifesta. Did we made an effort in trying to unite, I wouldn't say, bring different voices together, and did it worked at a certain moment? I am relatively positive and optimistic. Why? In both in OASA, this education center, I don't know, I have 100 slides which I couldn't show. The OASA, the Education Center for Young Adults and Children, was very much focusing on allowing children and young adults to tell the stories about the war and about what happened with their parents or grandparents, because I produced 4 television panels, and one was about a group of people who experienced the Kosovo War and some of the cultural leaders from Ukraine. And there was a very interesting discussion in which the Kosovar people said, it's only now the second generation who slowly starts talking about the traumas in the war. And there were many people in our team also who had traumas of the war. The separation, the apartheid in the school system, the apartheid in the medical system, all these things came out. That's also how we found out that we don't need an exhibition place for this Center for Narrative Practice, but we transformed it into a reference library about traumas or trauma development. We changed it into a podcast studio. Young children were learned how to tell their stories in podcasts, which didn't exist. We started a radio station. Now they came up with their own ideas, how in schools these kind of stories could be told. And actually, I remember in this one of the televised panel between the Ukrainians and Eremir Krasniqi from Oral History, that she said to the Ukraine culture leaders, you are starting now, immediately when the war is still there, mapping it, archiving it, identifying it, also pointing out to those people. It took us 20 years before Tachi is in The Hague, and we leave it to The Hague instead of analyzing and starting activities ourselves at that time after the war. It was an extremely learning experience in which I think Manifesta as an incubator started developing maybe some gestures of new hope. And I'm very thankful that we are allowed to continue this Center for Narrative Practice, which really is and it's going to be financed for the next 4 years by United Nations, because it is seen as an alternative model or instrument for reconciliation. Because you really saw, I mean, there are films about it on internet where Turkish and Serbian and Albanian people were sitting together talking about the pre-war period where they were all living in this community and studying there and trying to reinvent what could be done in the future through this tiny little modest institution in bringing up the dialogue between the different communities. So Manifesta could maybe do a tiny, tiny little step in this direction.
Yeah, about the reconciliation and repair, I guess that's one of the powers, potential powers of art. It's not that it always happens, but we keep trying, you know, and I guess that's what art could be good for, because certain things we have to stay silent about, and an artwork might be a medium in which how to touch upon what cannot be said yet, for example, in such a traumatic place, right? And I worked with Małgorzata before the Polish Pavilion. I worked with her also in Kosovo, and she was sewing these big hair stories of various Roma women. And then we started to speak about the reparative force of the needle. So how a needle as a tool is a tool that is sewing, you know, repairing a fabric that has been torn apart. And how art in a similar way, and this echoes also Louise Bourgeois and her statement of a magic power of the needle. How could we think of art as a needle, as a tool that performs some kind of, maybe never completed, but still try, because there will be a scarf always if you repair jeans. You will still see that there is a scarf, but how can art be part of the system? So, you know, it's not that there is one formula. It's that I think the Autostrada Biennial people, Lotrim and Vatra and Barry's, the founders, they are placing themselves in this kind of dialogy. This is how they think of art. This is how they actually have hope in what they're doing. And this, of course, involves inviting also Serbian artists or doing some projects around common history, you know, something that seems like it's not a common legacy, the Yugoslavian past, and yet there are ways maybe of finding something. So that's, you know, why we should keep on trying.
And as a moderator of all the series of talks, I would like to remind that we had a separate conference dedicated to art being a weapon and art being a target at war, and we touched upon the question of why culture is always considered a place for a dialogue and for, you know, kind of resolving the conflict and a place for reconciliation, while sometimes it has to actually provoke the conflict. And speaking about reconciliation, we were very clear about the point that Ukrainians are going to speak about reconciliation in any kind of platform only after the justice is there. So, you know, until all the war criminals are you know, taken to responsibility and the war is over and all our territories are back and we have all the reparations, we will not be ready for any type of reconciliation with the aggressive power. And, you know, try to kind of imagine if you want to reconcile a victim of the rape with someone who raped it during the rape being done. I don't think that's the way you think about it. So just keeping in mind that while the crime is being still committed, you don't think about reconciliation. Sorry, it's just that we have all our meetings and discussions online. You can find them on the YouTube channel of Ukrainian Institute. We spent really like 2 days speaking about this point and this question, and everyone is welcome to listen to it. And I see that we actually ran out of time, but if there is any other question and comment, I think we can still afford 1, 2. How many do we have? 2. Okay, let's do 2, and it will be done for today. You just speak. Just start speaking.
Hello. Yes, I will try to be brief. I'm Hanna Rudek from the Hanenko Museum, Ukraine. I'm very interested in, as a researcher, as currently I'm a researcher of decolonizing practices and ideas of European museums of Islamic and Asian art, historical art. And I'm very interested in the question. My personal experience as researcher of the project is that decoloniality is, first of all, and well, it's only a personal ethical choice. And according to this choice, or according of its absence, the project or the institution or the community moves along this certain trajectory of decolonizing. So it's first of all an ethical choice for justice, for solidarity, for humbleness, personal humbleness, or other values. The values many of us here and many of people living in the world were not born to the world where these kind of values were on the top. So it's I wonder how your professional communities, how people you are collaborating with, or you are affiliated with some institutions, how do you feel, how do you perceive this ethical movement, personal movement, individual movement of decoloniality, of internal decoloniality, self-decoloniality is widespread or widespreading in Germany, in Poland, and in your particular professional communities?
Who would like to answer?
Thanks for the question. I think for me it's pretty easy and sad to answer, but I think this mindset is not very widespread because, like from my experience, it's pretty widespread to point fingers. And so even if you talk about such issues, it's usually finding someone else who's guilty of being colonial or something, if you are sensitive to these questions at all, rather than being ready to try to decolonize yourself. So I think that's the answer, that's hard work. And just as a little comment to the discussion before, and maybe a link also to the Biennale we are hosted by, it just came to my mind when you talked about the textile and the potentials of this work. I think also the textile metaphors can be quite strong in, like, for thinking about things differently, like less heroically. And I think somewhere in the Biennale at the beginning, there's also a reference to the carrier bag theory of fiction, which is this short text, which also kind of points to how really, like, there's a certain epistemology that is so strong and that is so hard to get rid of if you're educated in it. And but if you would, maybe that would be one step towards self-decolonialization.
Thank you. Is there any other question or comment? Yeah, thanks.
Hello, I'm Linda Kailandi from the Estonian Academy of Arts, and thank you so much for these inspiring discussions and ideas. While listening to you, I got the feeling really that both of the phenomena that were discussed here today, the decoloniality and biennials, in many ways in crisis, or at least facing a lack of fresh ideas and practices, especially when looking at these from an Eurocentric perspective. And then one might also argue that bringing more strongly in the Eastern European voice and the perspective might be one of the ways how to bring in new practices, ideas, perspectives, especially again in a European perspective. But in your opinion, what should be done next then? What would be the good strategies and practices to bring out the Eastern European voice more strongly in the next biennales?
Just a short comment. It's just like fits perfectly into my closing note. And my closing note was that actually the Biennial hosts the Ukrainian Pavilion public program, and I think it's the only public program that's hosted by the Biennial. So we already are given the voice, and we are using it to speak to other East European countries in particular about this. And if you notice, the program consists mostly from experts from the East European countries, and these are female voices. And one idea that how can this continue is, let's say, maybe the Venice Biennale would have at least once a curator from Eastern Europe. There were none until now. Yeah, and everyone else who wants to everyone else who wants to comment or answer?
Sorry, you wanted first?
Oh, I think it's a question which you could have asked 25 years ago in Manifesta, because I remember Victor Misiana was our president, or Katalin Nerai, and all these East European curators, and I always had to explain why. And I didn't understand why I had to explain if suddenly some fantastic expert, Igor Sabel, who's passed away, I always had to make like extra effort to appoint those wonderful specialists on these positions. And I had really hoped that this situation would have been over, and because I think we need to open up, but this question could also come from Marseille, because in Marseille or in Northern Africa, they're also the same. And I remember Murcia, Manifesta 8, was exactly having one curatorial team from the Middle East, from Palestine and Israel, one curatorial team transit from Central and East European, and one curatorial team from Northern Africa. And I think it only dealt about the composition of those three teams and how almost like extraordinary this was, why it should have been the exact opposite and the normal practice to do. So I think there is a lot of decolonial, self-decolonial questioning, very sensitive questioning to everybody. Why is the director of the Venice Biennale still a white person over 75 and not somebody else? And there's still Italian curators, mostly Italian curators. So these are the relevant questions to ask. We should ask them. We should face those questions, even if we don't have the answers all the time. I agree.
Yeah, maybe this is just a footnote, but it came also to my mind, speaking of Documenta. It's really interesting what I experienced this summer as also being one of those 1,500 Documenta participants. I repeatedly got press, like the press office contacted me because Eastern German media wanted Eastern German Documenta participants, and there were hardly any. There were 2, and one of them was me. So, and like also like in the recent, and this is also of course something that remains quite invisible because it's a kind of passing, or you don't really know, and maybe, but it's like 15 years ago when I worked for Documenta 12 in the art mediation team, I think I was also the only one who was living in the eastern part or coming from the eastern part of Germany, except Berlin. I mean, Berlin is an exception. But so also in Documenta, we always speak about diversity, like on a large scale and those things, but even like in inner German, there are inner German power differences still very much present. And also maybe this has to do, again, also with the ways we perform certain positions and ways of dealing with things. I'm pretty sure maybe also, again, who raises their voice in what ways, or who feels comfortable in what kinds of settings, and how maybe we have to change settings in order for other people. But then also we are very close to feminism again, so but maybe there is this link. So this was just a footnote I wanted to share because I found this quite astonishing.
Thank you for saying this, because this shows where the decolonization should start, in your own, like, you know, in your own backyard, yeah.
May I finish about this topic discussing, looking from Ukrainian perspective again. That's what for I'm here. If thinking about what should be our next steps in continuing this decolonization efforts, I would say we shouldn't take off our legs tucked into the international door, because that's what Ukrainians did for the last 9 months. Now we have a voice, now we need a loudspeaker, not just to shout loud, but to dig deeper.
in the academic field, in the institutional field, I mean internationally, making publications, discussions, starting the big discussion, meta discussion. I would also be happy to see the curator of Venice or some else big biennial from the Eastern Europe or even from Ukraine. That would be great. I think next what we need is not just providing the changes, but being the changes.
Wonderful, wonderful discussion. Thank you so much for your inputs and for being so honest and rooted in all these topics and sharing your expertise and your experiences. We will continue tomorrow. Tomorrow we are waiting for you at this the same time we began today at 3 o'clock Central European time. Again in Venice and online, of course. I just wanted to remind everyone we are streamed onto YouTube and Facebook pages of the Ukrainian Institute and all our partners. And tomorrow we will begin with a beautiful film on from the program of the Berlin Biennial this year from an Indian artist, and then we will follow up with the lecture of Hanna Rudik and a discussion. So please come tomorrow. The discussion will be as interesting and the lecture will be as insightful, and the movie is just amazingly beautiful. See you all tomorrow and have a good evening. Bye-bye.